interesting thing, that a history that is not taught. And part of my interest in this subject, not only because of my own health challenges, but once I uncovered the fact that I was lied to about my health and my body and health and medicine in general, I began to question just about everything that I was taught. And as I uncovered these different areas of inquiry, I found out indeed there's an official story about these things, including the official story of modern medicine. We're raised as if it's always been here, it's always been this way, and the only doctors you could consult are medical doctors that prescribe patent medicines approved by the Federal Food and Drug Administration, that I often call the Fear and Death Administration, because of the promotion of products that are, in fact, the leading cause of death, not the third, second, but the first, in fact, when you start taking it all into account. So looking back at the history, I became intrigued as to how did we get here? How did we get here? And that opened up a huge can of worms. Now, as a homeopath, eventually I learned about many things in history that we were not taught, and even including the fact that in the Civil War, the war between the states, some describe it as the War of Northern Aggression, depending on your historical perspective, you would go, even today, you go to a Civil War museum in the South, and it is fascinating that you will find in the medical field kits, the little kits that they have, first aid kits, they all had homeopathic medicine in there. I was steeped in the tradition growing up a lot of my years in the South in the Civil War. Never once did we ever acknowledge that there was anything like that in these kits, much less herbal medicine. And so there was a whole history that was hidden from me. Now, eventually I was introduced to Harris Coulter. He wrote a series of books called Divided Legacy. I mean, these are books you can work out with. You can become big like you, Ty. And it's just incredible the history that was hidden from us about the schism between what we call homeopathic and naturopathic thought forms versus allopathic thought forms, where they poisoned the body using mercury and different things. And that's where Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, who was a physician in his day in the late 18th and early 19th century, determined that the medicine that he was giving his patients was more harmful than the disease. And he couldn't stomach that, and that's where he was motivated to develop a system that became a broad-based worldwide system called homeopathy.
Now we start to go backward in time. How did that happen? The fact that these great medical teaching universities and teaching centers are so great is because they've had a lot of money given to them. Where did the money come from? Now we're on the trail. You know, the old saying, follow the money, and that'll take you right to it. Well, if you follow the money, you'll find out that most of it came from the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry knows that if they give large grants to these universities, they have a double benefit. First of all, they have the appearance of being philanthropists. You know, they're doing good things, and that's always, it's good for public relations. But the other advantage is far more important, because once you have financed a research project, you now have a sort of a first right to whatever comes out of that research. And consequently, you can determine in what areas the research will go. I can assure you that if I'm a big pharmaceutical company and I give a $20 million grant to a research group, I'm not going to be very happy if they start to research whether or not dandelions can be used in the control of cancer. I want to make sure they're going to research a drug that I am working on in the laboratories right now. That's where I want the research to go. So they realize that they can take their own research budget and transfer it to a university or some research laboratory and get a tax deduction for it, knowing full well that if that's what they're researching, that's what the data is going to be. So I don't need to go any further. You can understand when the money is coming from a source which has a vested interest in the outcome. Now what's going to happen is the outcome is going to be what the donor wants it to be generally. So this is the problem, and that goes back even further in time to the turn of the last century, when the Rockefeller Group and the Carnegie Group actually came together, and they decided that they would reform medical education in America.
This sounded like an altruistic plan to reform medical school education, but could there be a more insidious purpose behind the whole thing?
At the time of the late 1800s and early 1900s, 20th century, medical schools taught a lot of different things. There were homeopathic medical schools, there were naturopathic schools, there were eclectic herbal type medicine schools, and so it was all there. There was not one way. And what happened was that the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations were interested in establishing the one way. How would they do that? Well, they would get a hold of the education system and create a medical monopoly via basically eliminating all competition to patent petrochemical medical education. That's the Flexner Report of 1910, it became known. Abraham and Simon Flexner, were hired to do this. It was a preordained commission report.
Not surprisingly, the basis of the report was that it was far too easy to start a medical school and that most schools were not teaching sound medicine. Let me translate this for you. These natural health colleges were not pushing enough chemical drugs manufactured by who? Carnegie and Rockefeller. The AMA, who were evaluating the various medical colleges, made it their job to target and shut down the larger respected homeopathic colleges. Carnegie and Rockefeller began to immediately shower hundreds of millions of dollars on these medical schools that were teaching drug-intensive medicine.
Oh, by the way, when they donated the money, the donors would say, well, now we've given you a lot of money and we know you're going to do the right thing with it, but would you object if we had someone from our staff appointed to your board of directors, just to make sure that just to see how our money is being spent, Well, that was really a condition of getting the money, so the university said, well, that would be fine. Anybody that you would suggest would be, I'm sure, more than adequate. So they began to load up the boards of directors of these teaching centers with people who literally were on the payroll of the donors. So once that was in place, the curriculum of the universities, the teaching centers, swung completely in the direction of pharmaceutical drugs, and it has remained that way ever since.
Predictably, those schools that had the financing churned out the better doctors. Oh, wait a minute. Or should I say, the more recognized doctors. In return for the financing, the schools were required to continue teaching course material that was exclusively drug-oriented, with no emphasis on natural medicine. By 1925, over 10,000 herbalists were out of business. By 1940, over 1,500 chiropractors would be prosecuted for practicing quackery. The 22 homeopathic medical schools that flourished in the 1900s dwindled down to just 2 by 1923. By 1950, all the schools teaching homeopathy were closed. In the end, if a physician did not graduate from a Flexner-approved medical school and receive an MD degree, then he or she could not find a job anywhere. This is why today MDs are so heavily biased towards synthetic drug therapy